Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one. Charlie Johns was 22 years old when he decided to marry Eunice Winstead, who was only 9. The union took place in Tennessee and shocked the country, but in the local community it was accepted without major questioning, even seen as common in poor rural areas. The case made newspapers, became a national controversy, and was even used in debates about the legality and morality of child marriage in the United States. The Rothschild Surrealist Ball of 1972, held at the luxurious Château de Ferrières, became famous for its disturbing masks and enigmatic atmosphere that seemed straight out of a Baroque nightmare. The event fueled long-standing conspiracy theories surrounding the family accused of controlling global wealth and manipulating wars. The style of the ball, filled with dark symbolism, only reinforced rumors of hidden power and obscure intentions. Carolina Olsson from the village of Ökno in Sweden lay down in 1876 at 14 years old and entered a deep sleep that lasted 32 years. Doctors could not explain the condition, described as trance or catatonia. The family cared for her for decades with milk, sugar water, and a dark room. She woke up in 1908 speaking like a teenager and resumed simple tasks. Her case remains one of the greatest medical enigmas of the 19th century. Dr. John Fryer, who was gay, shocked the psychiatric community in 1972 when he spoke wearing a mask, denouncing that homosexuality was not a disease, but an identity. In his speech, he exposed how colleagues were persecuted, fired, and silenced because of their orientation. His courageous act pressured the American Psychiatric Association, which in 1973 officially removed homosexuality from the list of mental disorders. The Bobby Dunbar case remains one of the greatest child disappearance mysteries. In 1912, the boy vanished during a family trip, and months later a child was identified as him and raised as Bobby into adulthood. However, DNA tests conducted nearly a century later revealed that the boy found was not Bobby. To this day, the whereabouts of the real boy remain unknown. This black mask was worn by a criminal known only as Mr. Cruel, responsible for attacking girls in Melbourne, Australia, in the 1980s and 1990s. His face was never revealed, and he left very few clues which confused the police. Despite extensive investigations, including searches in thousands of houses, the case remains unsolved and is remembered as one of the country's most disturbing criminal mysteries. The interior of Ed Gein's house revealed a true nightmare: piles of garbage, filth, and human remains turned into grotesque furniture and utensils. Living alone and isolated, Gein spent nights digging up corpses from nearby cemeteries for his macabre art. The environment was so unsanitary and disturbing that after his arrest, authorities decided to demolish the property to erase that horrific scene. The Amityville house in New York gained notoriety after the 1974 massacre, when Ronald DeFeo Jr. murdered his parents and 4 siblings. The property, which once had the motto "High Hopes" in the backyard, became the scene of a tragedy that marked criminal history in the United States. The following year, the Lutz family moved in and reported disturbing experiences. In 1976, investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren set up automatic cameras in the Amityville house, and one of them captured one of the most famous paranormal images in history. The photograph shows what appears to be a boy with glowing eyes looking back in the second-floor hallway. Many believe it to be John DeFeo, murdered there by his own brother in 1974. The image became a symbol of the case, reinforcing the residence's sinister reputation to this day. The sequence of self-portraits by William Utermohlen is a devastating visual record of the progress of Alzheimer's. In 1967, he still portrayed himself with firmness and detail, but from the 1990s, his declining mind began to reflect on canvas. The lines became confused, the forms dissolved, and within a few years, his face practically disappeared from his own memory. His art became a painful testimony of the loss of identity. The Nanjing Massacre in 1937 marked one of the cruelest episodes of the war. Japanese troops raped about 80,000 women and massacred up to 350,000 civilians in a few weeks. The violence included mass executions and acts of pure cruelty, such as competitions among soldiers to see who could decapitate 100 prisoners faster, turning death into a spectacle reported as if it were sport. A patient in treatment for mental illness in Germany in 1890 is seen restrained against the wall in a cruel method considered therapeutic. At the time, disorders such as depression, anxiety, or epilepsy were poorly understood and often confused with demonic possession. Patients suffered severe punishments instead of care, turning hospitals into places of torment rather than healing. Stranded in the Sahara Desert after his car broke down in 1993, French electrician Émile Loray did the unthinkable. He completely dismantled his Citroën 2CV and, with improvised parts, built a functional motorcycle to escape the inhospitable region. Without shelter, he spent days inside the car's shell while working on his contraption. In the end, he managed to drive to a small town where he received help. This was how headaches were treated in 1895. A person's head was placed against an anvil while a man prepared to strike with a hammer. At the time, it was believed the pain came from evil spirits or excess pressure in the skull. In the first half of the 20th century, the California Alligator Farm in Los Angeles offered unusual attractions to the public, such as picnics and photo sessions next to live alligators. Visitors could walk among the animals or even pose lying on them, believing they were tamed. The place operated for decades, attracting crowds in search of exotic entertainment that today would be unthinkable. Early 20th century Halloween costumes draw attention for their disturbing appearance. Children wore improvised masks made of burlap sacks, paper, or adapted doll heads, often covering the entire face in a frightening way. The lack of safety rules and the use of homemade materials helped create sinister looks that today seem straight out of a horror movie. In the 1920s, women could be fined or arrested for wearing swimsuits considered too short on beaches in the United States. Police officers measured the distance between the hem of the bathing suit and the knee to check compliance with the rules. The enforcement was part of the strict morality codes of the time, which sought to control how people dressed in public. The practice of foot binding, known as the Golden Lotus, marked Chinese history for nearly 1,000 years. Girls had their toes broken and their feet tightly wrapped to reach the ideal size of about 3 inches. Although it began to fade in the 1930s, it still persisted in rural areas for decades. The last Lotus shoe factory closed only in 1999. During World War II, it was believed that spraying entire houses with DDT mixed with kerosene was the most effective way to combat malaria. Soldiers sprayed beds, walls, and even children without any protection, confident that the chemical miracle would save lives. Decades later, it was discovered that DDT was highly toxic and carcinogenic. In the early 1900s, students at the Glasgow School of Art presented theatrical performances that today seem like nightmares. Wearing long dark robes and exaggerated white masks, they explored symbolism and surrealism in their artistic creations. The result was unsettling enactments where the figures looked like faceless ghosts, turning the stage into a disturbing spectacle. Children appear holding giant melons in a photograph taken in Saint-Hyacinthe, Quebec, in 1924. This type of image was part of a tradition called tall tales, photographic montages that showed enormous fruits, oversized insects, or gigantic animals. Produced as postcards, they were very popular in the early 20th century and entertained the public with impossible scenes. Margaret Howe-Lavatt, a 23-year-old researcher, was chosen to live in an adapted house in the Virgin Islands alongside dolphins during a NASA experiment in the 1960s. The goal was to teach the animals to communicate with humans, but the study became notorious for an absurd detail. Reports claim that Lovat manually stimulated a dolphin to prevent its sexual impulses from interfering with learning sessions. Horse diving was a popular spectacle between the late 19th and early 20th centuries, attracting crowds at fairs and amusement parks. Horses, sometimes mounted by people, jumped from platforms as high as 60 feet into pools of water. Although advertised as entertainment, the act posed countless risks to both the animals and the riders, later being banned after strong criticism of mistreatment. In 1931, Betty Robinson survived a plane crash but was mistakenly declared dead and placed in the trunk of a car heading to the morgue, where it was discovered she was still breathing, though in a coma. It took months to regain consciousness and years to walk again. Even without being able to bend her knees, she trained with superhuman effort and, in 1936, joined the United States relay team, winning gold in one of the most incredible stories in athletics. Blanche Monnier, heir of an aristocratic French family, was kept locked in a filthy, sunless room for 25 years. The reason was that she had fallen in love with a poor lawyer, which her mother and brother considered a disgrace. Found after an anonymous tip, Blanche was malnourished, covered in filth, and almost unrecognizable, becoming a symbol of one of the most shocking cases of family cruelty in France. In the middle of the forests of California, the Bohemian Grove became the stage for one of the most mysterious gatherings in the world. Every summer, powerful political and financial figures gathered before a colossal owl idol for enigmatic rituals. The secrecy surrounding these ceremonies has fueled conspiracy theories for decades, suggesting hidden pacts and global decisions made under torchlight. The young unknown woman found drowned in the Seine River at the end of the 19th century had such a serene expression that it drew attention at the time, so doctors decided to mold a death mask of her face. Known as the Unknown Woman of the Seine, her identity was never revealed, but her image endured through time. Decades later, the young woman's face would be used as the model for the CPR training mannequin, teaching generations to save lives. When parcel post service was created in the United States in 1913, the rules allowed large packages to be mailed, including children, as long as they did not weigh more than 11 pounds and had stamps. Some families used this loophole to send small children to distant relatives cheaply. The mailing of children was banned in 1915 after curious cases attracted national attention. In the 19th century, French neurologist Duchenne de Boulogne conducted frightening experiments to understand how facial muscles created human expressions. Using electric shocks on restrained patients, he artificially provoked fear, pain, or surprise, recording everything in images. Although these studies helped found modern neuroscience, the methods looked more like torture than science. John Mainz, a German-American farmer, was the victim of a brutal attack in Luverne, Minnesota. Dragged from his home by residents, he was whipped, tarred, and feathered, a common practice of public humiliation. The attack occurred amid the strong anti-German sentiment that spread through the United States during World War I, when descendants of immigrants were often targets of violence and persecution. The cangue was a heavy wooden board placed around the necks of the condemned as a form of punishment and public humiliation in East Asia. It could weigh more than 20 pounds and prevented simple movements, making even eating or sleeping a challenge. Used for centuries, the punishment persisted in some regions until the early 20th century and was sometimes applied for minor infractions such as speeding. During the Prohibition years, a sign on the back of a car read, "I am not a smuggler. Do not shoot. I will stop," showing the fear of innocent drivers of being mistaken for criminals. Alcohol smuggling dominated the black market, and police pursued criminals harshly, leading civilians to use unusual ways to avoid being shot. This couple participates in the San Juan de los Lagos Fair in Mexico, where extreme penance rituals were common. The woman wears a veil of anonymity, a crown of thorns, and a nopal embedded in her chest, symbols of pain and faith. In her hands, she carries a plate to collect her own blood, offered as a promise to the Virgin of San Juan, one of the country's most venerated figures. Racial segregation in the United States imposed for decades the separation of public spaces and services between whites and blacks. The Jim Crow laws upheld the false idea that contact could contaminate whites, an absurd excuse used to justify separation. These racist regulations only began to be dismantled with the civil rights movement in the 1960s. With the end of Prohibition approaching, breweries rushed to fill their stocks, forming mountains of crates that looked like walls. The urgency was so great that some warehouses could barely hold such a quantity of barrels and bottles. On the first legalized day, Americans consumed about 1.5 million barrels of beer. At just 8 years old, children were already descending into the depths of coal mines in the United States in the early 1900s, facing exhausting shifts in suffocating and dangerous environments. Many inhaled toxic dust, suffered fatal accidents, and rarely had access to school. Child labor was seen as a natural part of family survival until labor laws began to combat this brutal reality decades later. Men held children in the water using poles with ropes tied to their bodies so they could learn to swim without sinking. This curious teaching method was used in the 1920s in rivers and lakes, when there were still few swimming lessons in pools. Death masks were plaster or wax molds applied directly to the face of the recently deceased, a bizarre practice common until the early 20th century. Made to preserve the features of the dead, they were used in the creation of busts, statues, or kept as mementos. Although intended as tributes, today they cause discomfort due to the way they dealt with the memory of the deceased. During World War II, many Britons slept inside the so-called Morrison shelters, iron structures that resembled large cages placed in the middle of living rooms. The goal was to protect residents against house collapses during air raids. Although uncomfortable, the shelter could support the weight of rubble, saving lives amid the chaos of the Blitz. In the 1950s and 1960s, inventors presented automatic machines capable of serving chilled whiskey as if it were soda. Some even suggested installing them in offices to increase employee productivity, an absurd idea that never materialized. In 1960, one of these machines was exhibited at the Second Vending Exhibition in London, England. In the 1930s in Tokyo, students marched in parades wearing gas masks. These acts were part of collective training against possible chemical attacks, a constant fear after World War I. In addition to practical preparation, the parade had a psychological effect to remind people daily that the invisible threat could appear at any moment. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia gained fame by declaring war on crime and illegal gambling in New York. To show strength, he ordered that confiscated weapons and slot machines be dumped into the sea at Long Island Sound, creating real underwater metallic heaps. The gesture, which seemed like an exemplary act of justice, today sounds absurd, turning the ocean into a dump for criminal scrap. The curious device shown on this woman's head belongs to the practice of phrenology, a pseudoscience popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The technique claimed that bumps on the skull revealed personality traits and mental abilities. The device was used to map regions of the brain, supposedly identifying well-developed characteristics in each individual. Babies were placed in suspended cages to get fresh air outside windows in London in the 1930s. The practice emerged as a way to strengthen children's health amid fears of respiratory diseases, allowing them to receive sun and ventilation even in cramped apartments. Despite the danger, there are no records of serious accidents related to this unusual habit. Detectives hired by Macy's posed with their backs turned in 1948 to avoid being recognized. These professionals, also called secret eyes, were common in large department stores in the United States since the early 20th century. Their work included observing customers, identifying suspects, and even following thieves outside the store, later collaborating with the police. Helen Hulick, a teacher from Los Angeles, became a symbol of resistance in 1938 when she refused to change her pants for a dress while testifying in a robbery trial. The judge considered her outfit disrespectful to the court and sentenced her to 5 days in jail. The case attracted press attention and marked one of the first public fights for women's right to wear pants in formal settings. Before motorized trucks dominated the streets, firefighters relied on horses to pull heavy wagons loaded with water and equipment. These animals were trained to react immediately to the alarm bell and gallop through avenues, clearing the way among carriages and pedestrians. The scene was so common that horses came to be considered true heroes of the fire brigade. On the eve of Thanksgiving in 1938, butcher shops displayed huge numbers of birds hanging from their facades to attract customers. In the photo, hundreds of turkeys and ducks are lined up from the roof to the door. This practice of mass display disappeared over time due to hygiene and preservation concerns. Robert McGee survived a scalping in 1864 when he was only 13 years old. Orphaned, he was attacked by the Sioux tribe and left with permanent scars on his scalp. At that time, scalping was a relatively common practice in confrontations between settlers and native peoples of North America, used as a symbol of victory or intimidation. McGee became one of the rare documented survivors of this brutal act. A Mickey Mouse-shaped gas mask was created in 1942 during World War II to protect children in case of chemical attacks. The project included the collaboration of Walt Disney, who worked with Civil Defense in Washington. The strategy aimed to reduce children's fear of the mandatory use of protective masks, combining a cultural icon with the harsh reality of war. Ella Harper, remembered as the Camel Girl, was born in 1870 with a rare condition called congenital genu recurvatum, which caused her knees to bend backward. Because of this, she supported herself on her hands and feet to move, resembling the walk of a camel. She was an attraction in circuses in the United States, but left the stage shortly after to pursue studies and a life outside public exposure. During World War II, a brown bear named Wojtek was officially integrated into the Polish army, receiving a rank and a soldier number. Adopted as a cub, he learned to march, carry ammunition, and even drink beer with his companions. His fame grew after he helped transport boxes of shells during the Battle of Monte Cassino, becoming a symbol of courage and a beloved mascot of the troops. In the 1950s, residents of Las Vegas watched nuclear explosions almost as if they were tourist attractions. Just a few miles from the city, the United States government conducted atomic tests in the Nevada desert, producing huge mushroom-shaped clouds visible from homes, hotels, and pools. Families even gathered to watch the detonations, unaware of the radiation risks. Members of the Ku Klux Klan appear in an amusement park riding a Ferris wheel in 1925. The photo was taken during a period of strong growth of the group in the United States. In addition to violent actions, the organization also promoted social gatherings to reinforce its presence in daily life and attract new followers. In the 1950s, Operation Doorstep tested the devastating effects of nuclear explosions on domestic settings. Entire houses were built in the Nevada desert and filled with mannequins dressed as typical families of the time, surrounded by furniture and appliances. The goal was to observe how the shockwave and extreme heat would impact ordinary people in the event of a nuclear attack, revealing the terrifying fragility of daily life. In the factories of Thiers in the early 20th century, knife grinders spent the day lying on their stomachs over low benches, a posture that avoided chronic spinal curvature but punished their bodies. To relieve constant cold and poor circulation, dogs were placed on workers' legs. The environment was unhealthy, filled with metallic dust, and many ended up developing serious respiratory diseases. Kangaroo boxing emerged in the late 19th century and spread through Europe and the United States as a curious circus and fair attraction. animals were trained to enter rings and face clowns or boxers before lively audiences. The practice lasted until the mid-20th century, when it began to be widely criticized and abandoned because of mistreatment of kangaroos. In 1924, Chicago introduced a curious pool-shaped car wash where cars plunged in to remove mud from dirt roads. Called the Auto Wash Bowl, the system consisted of a circular tank where vehicles were guided by the current until clean. Although ingenious, many drivers complained that the pressure did not reach the upper part of the cars, leaving them clean only halfway up. Mary Todd Lincoln, widow of President Abraham Lincoln, posed for a portrait in which she appears accompanied by the ghostly image of her murdered husband. Montages like this, known as spirit photographs, were very popular in the 19th century. Entire families appear wearing gas masks on the streets of England in 1939, shortly before the beginning of World War II. The government distributed millions of these devices to civilians as a preventive measure against chemical attacks, which were feared after the use of poison gas in World War I. Public tests aimed to accustom adults and children to daily use of the object. Pissoirs were open-air public urinals installed in Paris starting in the mid-19th century. Created to reduce filth in the streets, they quickly multiplied and reached over 1,000 units spread across the city at their peak. These cast-iron structures became a characteristic part of the Parisian urban landscape until they began to be replaced by more modern restrooms in the 20th century. Performing dogs were trained to stage human scenes in bizarre competitions, such as drinking in improvised bars, attracting curious crowds. The public enjoyed the idea of dogs imitating human habits, while posters and decorations completed the show. Although it seems absurd today, such presentations were seen as family entertainment at fairs and popular events of the early 20th century. These improvised ambulances from the early 20th century used motorcycles with adapted sidecars, where the patient was placed in narrow compartments resembling coffins. Often the lid was closed during transport, leaving the injured with almost no ventilation. Despite being rudimentary and frightening, these boxes on wheels were considered a practical solution for emergencies of the time. In July 1921, about 10,000 men crowded Times Square in New York to follow updates on the boxing match between Jack Dempsey and Georges Carpentier. The curious detail is that almost all of them wore hats, an item considered mandatory at the time. Demand was so high that factories produced millions per year, and a man without a hat in public could even be seen as rude or suspicious. The Taj Mahal received unusual protection against possible air raids during World War II. To hide its famous white dome and make it harder for enemy pilots to spot, a huge bamboo scaffold was erected. The structure covered part of the monument, attempting to camouflage it from a distance and preserve one of India's greatest treasures. In Russia during the 1960s, it was possible to see bears walking through the streets alongside trainers, often used in circuses and public performances. The animal, a cultural symbol of the country, even appeared in urban life, led on leashes among cars and pedestrians. These scenes, recorded in photographs of the time, reflect a period when the presence of domesticated bears was treated as part of ordinary life. Small, remotely controlled vehicles, called mini-tanks, were developed during World War II to carry explosives. Their goal was to advance discreetly toward enemy tanks, passing underneath them to detonate the charge. Although ingenious, the idea had limited results due to technical failures, but it left a unique record of the search for innovative weapons in the conflict. Motorcycle chariot races mixed modern speed with ancient inspiration, replacing horses with engines and dirt tracks with improvised arenas. The peak of this spectacle occurred in 1936, when crowds gathered to watch riders guiding powerful machines while standing like gladiators on wheels. The event, rare and short-lived, was recorded as one of the most bizarre practices in sports history. In the 1920s, doctors believed that so-called sunlight therapy could cure diseases such as malaria and strengthen children's health. Babies were placed in front of ultraviolet lamps wearing protective glasses in a practice that today seems absurd. This type of treatment remained in use for decades, only falling out of favor in the 1960s when studies proved its ineffectiveness. Victorian women sacrificed themselves in corsets so tight they reduced the waist to only 16 inches. Made with whalebone, they reshaped the body into an hourglass figure, but crushed ribs and caused internal damage. Doctors warned of serious risks, but the obsession with fashion prevailed. Some fainted in public, something seen as charming at the time. Men on horseback rode through the streets of Amsterdam in 1973 when the oil crisis led the government to restrict the use of cars. The measure was part of an effort to save fuel during the global shortage. On those days, horses, bicycles, and other alternative means took over the streets, temporarily transforming the daily life of the city. The strange photo booth image shows a woman next to an unknown man, taken shortly before her death. In June 1991, hotel employees found the decomposed body of this woman in a room rented by someone named only Eduardo. The man was never found, and the victim was never identified, turning the image into a disturbing mystery without answers to this day.